Hi everyone, glad to see you back on the channel. Today we're diving into a major international development that is dominating headlines around the world, involving one of the most strategically important and volatile regions on the planet. We're talking about recent statements from Iran's leadership warning of a potential wider regional conflict if the United States were to initiate military action, and Iran's dramatic designation of European Union armies as terrorist groups in response to diplomatic tensions. What's happening, why it matters, how different nations are reacting, and what this could mean for global security. We'll walk you through all of that in clear, easy-to-follow detail. This is a complex issue involving geopolitics, diplomacy, military strategy, law, international alliances, and the future of the Middle East. The heart of the situation centers on Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's stark warning that any U.S. military attack on Iran would not remain limited to a direct confrontation but would erupt into a wider regional conflict across the Middle East. This warning was made in the context of heightened tensions between Tehran and Washington, after months of increasing friction on diplomatic, military, and political fronts. As tensions have escalated, the stakes have grown, drawing in not only the US and Iran but also European nations, regional powers, and global institutions. Iran's statements come amid significant US military movements in the region. According to reports, the United States has deployed a substantial naval presence, including destroyers, an aircraft carrier, and additional combat ships, to the broader Middle East. These forces are often described in media reports and official statements as a deterrent or pressure tactic, aimed at compelling Iran to accept terms regarding nuclear negotiations or address concerns about human rights and internal unrest. In response, Tehran has repeatedly framed this buildup as provocative and dangerous, asserting that such actions increase the risk of miscalculation or unintended escalation. Ayatollah Khamenei's warning is rooted in Iran's view that its defense is existential, and any direct military strike would compel Tehran to react decisively. He emphasized that Iran does not seek to be the aggressor or initiate conflict, but that forceful retaliation would follow any attack. Khamenei's message repeatedly stressed that the consequences of war would spill far beyond Iran's borders, engulfing neighboring countries in instability, military clashes, and violence. This, in effect, is a deterrence warning, an attempt to communicate the potential price of military action to external powers. At the same time, Iran's leadership has tied recent warnings to broader narratives about perceived interference and hostility from the United States and its allies. For years, Tehran and Washington have been locked in a contentious relationship involving disputes over nuclear policy, sanctions, regional influence, and ideological rivalry. That long-standing tension has often manifested in proxy conflicts, diplomatic standoffs, and episodes of brinkmanship that have shaped Middle Eastern geopolitics for decades. Layers of complexity have been added by domestic dynamics within Iran itself. Over recent months, Iran has faced significant internal protests and unrest, initially sparked by economic grievances and later growing into broader political dissent in many cities. Iranian authorities described much of this unrest as sedition or akin to a coup, accusing external forces, including the United States and Israel, of trying to foment instability. While independent observers and human rights groups have documented widespread protests and heavy repression, Iranian officials have framed these events within a narrative of national defense against destabilizing foreign influence. This internal context is important because it has influenced both international perceptions of Iran and Tehran's readiness to adopt assertive rhetoric. The protests have resulted in thousands of deaths and arrests, according to various rights groups, and the harsh government response has provoked international criticism. In response, Western powers have stepped up their diplomatic and legal actions, including designating elements of Iran's powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as terrorists, a move that has angered Tehran and escalated the political confrontation. In fact, one of the most dramatic retaliatory moves by Iranian lawmakers has been the declaration that the armies of European Union countries, those that supported the terrorist designation of Iran's Revolutionary Guards, should themselves be considered terrorist groups under Iranian law. This was announced by the Speaker of Iran's parliament, who cited domestic legislation allowing for reciprocal designations. Members of parliament reportedly showed solidarity by wearing uniforms associated with the Revolutionary Guards and chanting anti-Western slogans. The designation of EU militaries as terrorist groups is largely symbolic in terms of practical international law, but it underscores the depth of Tehran's anger and the seriousness with which it views foreign criticism. It sends a message that Iran views punitive diplomatic actions, such as labeling one of its key security institutions as terrorist, not as isolated judgments but as hostile acts warranting strong countermeasures. The European Union's own designation of the Revolutionary Guard was rooted in concerns about violent crackdowns on protesters and human rights violations, reflecting deep unease among Western nations about Iran's internal and external policies. To many analysts, these reciprocal designations illustrate how diplomatic relations have deteriorated and how rhetoric can escalate beyond traditional diplomatic boundaries. Designating state armies as terrorists is an unprecedented step and not something that is currently recognized or acted upon by international bodies. Yet symbolically, it amplifies tensions and signals the likelihood of deeper polarization between Iran and Western governments. The implications of these developments are far-reaching. If a conflict were to escalate into a wider regional war, the effects could touch numerous countries across the Middle East, from the Gulf to the Levant and beyond. Neighboring states like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and others where Iranian influence is significant could become arenas for proxy battles. Israel, a longtime opponent of Iran's regional ambitions, could be drawn into direct or indirect conflict. Oil markets and global energy supplies could be disrupted severely if strategic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz were threatened or militarized. And global geopolitical alliances would be tested, with NATO members, Middle Eastern states, and global powers like China and Russia weighing in on diplomatic or security responses. Despite the stark warnings and tit-for-tat declarations, there remains some room for diplomatic engagement. Officials from both sides, Tehran and Washington, have suggested that talks might be possible under certain conditions. Some reports indicate that negotiations have been quietly discussed, with emphasis on finding solutions that might avert direct conflict. U.S. leaders have publicly stressed that military action is not inevitable, and that diplomatic solutions remain possible if certain issues, like Iran's nuclear program or human rights concerns, can be addressed through negotiation rather than force. Yet the window for diplomatic engagement is delicate. On one hand, Iran's leaders insist that any talks must be fair and non-discriminatory, preserving Iran's sovereignty and not forcing it to capitulate on core issues. On the other hand, Western nations, particularly the United States and certain EU members, have demanded concrete commitments and transparency on issues like nuclear enrichment and the treatment of protesters. Finding common ground in such an environment requires trust that is currently in short supply. Another factor to consider is how public opinion and domestic politics play into decision-making. In Iran, nationalist sentiment and opposition to foreign intervention can empower hardliners who prefer defiance over compromise. Among US and European audiences, concerns about terrorism, human rights abuses, and regional stability influence how leaders position themselves. These domestic pressures can make diplomatic flexibility more difficult, as leaders need to show strength and resolve to their own constituents. It is also crucial to understand that rhetoric about regional war and terrorist designations is part of a broader strategic narrative. Nations often use strong language to deter adversaries or to reinforce internal solidarity. While such statements sound alarming, they are part of how states signal intentions and resolve. Whether these signals translate into actual conflict depends on a range of factors: strategic calculations, leadership decisions, international mediation, economic pressures, and unforeseen events. In the immediate term, one of the most watched indicators will be the actions of military forces in the region. If deployments increase, patrols become confrontational, or proxy groups escalate attacks, the risk of unintended clashes rises. Conversely, if diplomatic contacts, even indirect ones, continue and channels for negotiation remain open, there may be opportunities to de-escalate before conflict erupts. International organizations and third-party states could play roles in mediating, though success in such endeavors has historically been mixed. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel.